Welcome. My name is Justin Mullins from New Scientist, and I will be chairing tonight's debate on disruptive technologies and the emerging threats that they pose for our society. My first task this evening is to introduce our panel. On my left, we have Dave Palmer, Director of Technology at Darktrace, a global artificial intelligence company engaged in the business of cyber defense. Dave has over 10 years of experience in government intelligence operations, having worked previously for both GCHQ and MI5. We have Kavitha Kishan. Kavitha is Deputy Director of National Security Science and Research at the Department for Transport. Kavitha is a physicist by training. I'm more in favor of physicists. And she's responsible for the strategic direction of national security science and research at the Department for Transport. We have Dave Short, Director of Technology at BAE Systems, where he oversees the way technology is used across the company. He is a systems engineer by training, and in past incarnations has worked on Typhoon, Tornado, and F-35 programs. And finally, we have Trevor Taylor, who heads up a research program in defense, industries, and society at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He is a veteran writer, commentator, and broadcaster on defense issues. So let's set the scene for tonight's debate. Disruptive technologies are changing the nature of society. Artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, and robotics are creating unprecedented changes in businesses and in society more broadly. Social technologies allow us to communicate in myriad ways and at unprecedented speed. But these disruptions also create opportunities for our adversaries, often in the grey zone, below the threshold of conventional war. These threats include new types of propaganda, the theft of intellectual property, uncertainties in energy supply, cyber attacks, and fake news. Their goal is to weaken our social and political cohesion and to undermine our freedoms and way of life. That raises an important set of questions. What kinds of preparations should we make to tackle these emerging threats? How should information-centric technologies play a part in this process? And how can these technologies help safeguard our freedom and way of life? Welcome to the New Scientist debate. So let me start with you, Dave Palmer. So how serious is the threat from cyberspace to our freedoms and our way of life?
I think we have our entire way of life online these days. I didn't know where this place was tonight. I used an app to help me get here. I came into London via long-distance rail technology, and that massively relies on signaling and internet connectivity for all sorts of different services, from buying my ticket to the actual health and safety operations of the train. And as we have added all of this complexity and taken our lives online, we've created lots and lots of new ways in which criminals or malcontents can start to interfere with our lives for various different gains. So I don't think it's that we can start to separate anymore what happens on the internet and online and our way of life, because our ways of life completely rely on that.
Thank you very much. Kavitha, as coming from the transport world, our transport networks have a particularly high profile, and that makes them an attractive target. What are things that are most concerning you in this area?
So I think it is the fact that the transport networks are there, and as you said, they are a target. Information that is available and that people can use to understand those transport networks, but also the way that they're evolving and changing. So that means new technologies are changing transport itself. So if you look at the rise of automation and what that's going to mean, that then changes how we need to think about security.
In what way?
So if people are using transport to travel differently, their expectations on speed, delays, the interconnection and the use of connectivity in the internet, and the need to make sure that everything is safe and secure by design, that poses new challenges and that we need to address them to make sure that the transport networks do stay functioning and secure.
Thank you. Dave Short. How are emerging technologies affecting you and the defense industry?
think in terms of the way in which technology is going these days, there's such a proliferation of technology. And if you go back to the 1980s or before, you often found that defence was actually driving forward those technologies. These days, there's such a proliferation of technology out there that can be applied back into the defence environment. It can be really disruptive in terms of how those technologies can be actually utilised. And going back to the cyber sort of situation, you know, it used to be that you had a natural regulation that came with technology from the point of view it's really quite difficult to put certain capabilities together because of the hardware that was required. If you want to put a tank or a bomb or a nuclear weapon together, it takes a bit of effort and a lot of skills. But when it comes to like the cyber environment, you actually have got that situation where the intellectual capacity of individuals and small groups has the ability to have just a potent outcome as you could get with any sort of bomb from history. And so I think when you actually also look at the way in which technology has been proliferating, you've actually got combinations of technology that's now start to come together, and it's that potent effect of the multiplication factor of different technologies. So for example, again, artificial intelligence, how it's applied with cyber, how it could be applied actually with sensors, which when you bring those things together, it becomes a multiplier that makes it even more disruptive. So I think we're in a world now where ever more technology that's having huge amounts of investment in it can be applied into a defence environment or be used by an adversary in such a way that can be really quite disruptive. And you have to anticipate how to counter those threats in an ever broader spectrum, in an ever more difficult set of dimensions.
Thank you. And Trevor, what are the most significant emerging threats from our international adversaries?
Well, if we think internationally, I think we can see that there are three sort of areas where there's a problem. Most obviously, you have Russia, where I think Russia is characterized by its government is very crudely fighting insignificance. I mean, it is a country that's economy is based still on natural resources and military power, and it is desperately trying to maintain some kind of importance, and doing that by trying to intimidate its neighbors and emphasizing the threat to it. And as David says, the cyber weapons are, relatively speaking, both inexpensive and can be done on quite a small scale, quite effective. It's quite appealing to Russia in that respect. With Russia, we've got a problem that it's a country that's not developing, it's not advancing. With China, you've got the issue that China has advanced very rapidly for the last 30 years and is now being much more assertive about the respect and standing and control and influence it should have in its area. It's a long way away from us, but nevertheless it's something that, because of UK policy, we take a significant interest in. And China again is trying, I think, in many ways to shortcut some of the problems that David talked about in terms of making major conventional systems like tanks and aircraft that are the same quality, but they are trying to be able to certainly put at risk American forces and end American domination in East Asia. And then, of course, you've got the problem, I suppose, of Islam, where at least some of its adherents are very dissatisfied and take an intense dislike to Western way of life. And so they're posing threats of one sort or another, most closely associated with terrorism, but there's no reason why they too couldn't adopt and adapt some of these techniques of basically information-based activities.
Thank you, Trevor. I want to get into some very specific areas, or more specific areas of technology, to see how you fare in those areas. And one thing that cropped up today was the landing on, or the attempted landing on the moon by an Israeli private company. And I think space is a very interesting area because access to space is getting cheaper. It's becoming a place where spacefaring nations are venturing further afield, the moon and Earth orbit and beyond. But it's also becoming a more crowded place. We have a risk of collisions. We have the attempted destruction of a satellite by the Indians last month, and carrying on a trend that's been started for some years in space-based weapons. Dave, Dave Short, how do emerging technologies influence the space industry for you?
I think in terms of, if you think about the way in which the world has become ever more interconnected. The same goes for the battle space environment. If you're going to be competitive, you need to have the situational awareness, you need to have the ability to react to a quickly evolving picture. And space is one of the layers that becomes increasingly important to actually ensure you maintain that interconnectivity. So if you think of it in terms of actually the way in which we use data links and secure links in the general environment at the moment, but space becomes another layer, either low Earth space or at high orbit, where you're actually trying to maintain the communications and try and keep that overall picture. And of course, we all know we've got vulnerabilities associated with space, and just a general reliance on things like GPS, invented in 1973, fundamentally changed the way in which the world operates. And almost people just take it for granted in terms of having that both from a military point of view and from a civil perspective. If you were to take out that sort of capability, that's very, very significant. And there's a vulnerability that comes from space and how we actually use space. And I think when we go to the future, it becomes another of those layers associated with how we fundamentally have to keep ourselves complete in that situational awareness picture. I think the other side of it, of course, is that as time progresses, we're going away from the more complex and cumbersome rockets to things which are a bit more accessible from the point of view, whether it be Blue Origin or whether it be SpaceX. The accessibility for space is changing all the time, and I think some of the goals which are being set by those private companies is going to make the private sector a very interesting way in which you can actually get to space ever more easily. So again, there's a vulnerability there in terms of actually keeping control of where that actually goes, where it's not purely government controlled. Mm-hmm. So I think it's an evolving picture.
And I think the cost per pound of getting things into space has not changed that drastically, but the capacity of the reducing size of electronics and the fact you can pack more and more into a small space has meant that you can send small satellites on smaller rockets. And of course, rockets, we might think of rockets as sort of high technology, but remember that the first rockets were of modern times were developed by the Germans in 1945, and I don't invite you to calculate how long it is since 1945, but it's quite a long time, and trying to keep that technology in a box is pretty difficult, so it's not surprising that it's spread.
Our transport systems, Kavitha, depend crucially on GPS. What kind of plans do we have there to mitigate problems should they arise with that system?
Well, part of it is about finding alternatives, so not being wholly dependent on any one single system. Yes, we rely on GPS, but looking at what are the other systems that you have in the transport, what can they have that are redundancies, what can people fall back on their basic knowledge. So do we still train our sea captains in how to use sextants if they need to? If the technology fails, you need to go back to what can the human do. We managed to work without it, so we have to make sure we still have the systems in place to do that if we need to. A lot of this comes down to how do we make sure our systems are resilient throughout. So whilst there may well be a risk of if we lose something that we're dependent on, can we still function without it?
And Dave Palmer, are space-based assets at risk from cyber attack?
Well, they certainly are. And this is a really interesting area at the moment. One thing that we know and have seen over and over again in history is when you have organizations like BAE that build things to a military standard, they tend to think a lot about risks, the trade-offs and resilience when firing things into space. But as we know that typical private industry, whether it's your smart TV or a voice assistant in your kitchen, private industry likes to get things out on the market as fast as humanly possible, and security is almost always an afterthought, no matter what the different types of technology that you think of. And when we think about swarms of microsatellites, or sometimes called CubeSats, what we're essentially talking about is lots of little Linux computers in space talking to each other over what happens to be like radio type technologies, but still fundamentally IP networks or internet style networks. And we start to see companies falling into some of the same traps that we saw maybe in the internet over the last 20 years. I was very far away, no one could hack it from there. Or the idea that this is a kind of bespoke thing. It doesn't look exactly like everyone else's computers. It's probably unhackable because only I've got the designs. And sadly, that's not true. We see attacks on space assets from the ground. We see increasingly attacks on space assets from space, where someone else has flown over a hostile satellite to sit in between all of your satellites that are talking to each other. And when they happen to be on the opposite side of the Earth from you being able to talk to them, start trying to get in the middle of conversations and maybe be a little bit disruptive. And sadly, normally the way that we get significant progress on these issues is someone's going to have a big failure somewhere, and maybe the rest of the corporate market will take notice. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in the GPS satellites or the military-based ones first. I think they will be far more hardened and defended than conventional corporate assets. But yeah, something normally has to go wrong before people start doing things well.
Okay. Well, let's open up the discussion to the audience. So we're looking for questions for our panelists or differing opinions. Raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Yes, this gentleman at the back there.
Hi, everyone. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few months about Huawei and the telecommunications company and the threat they pose to Western civilization. The United States, followed by Australia, have now banned their telecommunications, the part of their business that controls the telecommunications infrastructure. However, the UK is a bit hesitant to do so because they're wanting them to roll out the new 5G network, which would obviously impact everything from, like you were talking about, smart TVs to smart fridges. It would encompass almost everything that we use. I'm just wondering, is it a case of what does the US know that we don't, or are the US being too gung-ho in their censorship of Huawei?
Let me start with you, Dave Palmer.
I think we need to get used to the idea in the UK that the Western tech dominance is coming to an end, and we need to think about it more broadly than the fact that there's this relatively high-profile networking company. I have an iPhone, and bits of that will either have been built or sourced from China, and there's nothing I can do about that ever. And if someone wants to attack that in what's often called a supply chain attack, whether it's in the truck or it was affected in the factory, or someone's bribed an employee so that the iPhone that I eventually receive is more vulnerable than I would like, there is nothing, absolutely nothing I can do about that in isolation. What I need to start thinking about is the broader resilience of all the technology that we have, either in my personal life or in our corporate lives. I think there's a lot of politics going on, particularly with the situation that you've pulled out. But the thing I find most confusing about this entire discussion is we're really okay to say, hey, these Western tech companies can sell technology to all over the world, and every other nation needs to suck it up and buy Cisco or whatever. But whoa, we're not living with the risk the other way around. I think there's a lot of growing up we need to do as East and West become more evenly matched in all forms of technology, but hardware particularly.
Dave Short.
I suppose I maybe think that the Americans know what the art of the possible is and maybe have a clue of what somebody else is trying to do. And so, I mean, if you go back to 2007, 2008, the US really, in its own military policy, didn't really mention cyber that much at all. But by 2010, they actually used Stuxnet and actually managed to get the centrifuges to blow up in the Iranian reactors on the back of a big effort. And it only took a very small worm to actually get through to certain capabilities to actually then trigger the centrifuges. So that was a big effort between the US and Israel to avoid a big war. Now, if you think about, we're now 9 years further on, I think there's just could be a subtlety in there about intelligence being mixed with the art of the possible when you're actually looking at what you can do that says, be careful. Now, I think it's just the way things are in society, the more complex your society, which is basically the way, UK, US, it's a very integrated society, the more vulnerable you are. The number of opportunities and gates and things you have to protect just goes up. If you're in a sparse part of Africa, it's a relatively safe cyber zone in many respects. To what we've got a very highly tuned, highly interdependent society that we know. When we were just talking about it before, a couple of days of fuel shortage, and all of a sudden the whole thing starts to look a bit shaky. Everybody starts panicking after day 3. So we've got such a highly integrated society. It would not take an awful lot of some sort of trigger to actually take out, or even the remote listening that could make a difference. So I think it's a combination of, personally, I think it's a combination of intelligence with what they know that they can do.
I have here the government report published at the end of the last year said that they could offer only limited assurance that the Huawei telecommunications equipment could offered or posed no national security risk. Only limited assurance. Trevor, what's your take on this?
Well, I remember a report from 1998 in the United States which worried about external sources of supply for defense. So one of the things they were really concerned about is where the software was written. And the thing that they pointed to was a lot of the software that was on military systems actually used blocks of software that had come from places that actually came a long way back. It was very difficult to trace the origins of the software. And this is a modern manifestation of this. And I think there are two issues. That one is sort of our ability to check, which David's pointed to, about what actually you're getting when you're getting a Huawei system. And your ability to deconstruct it to see what's there. And the other is whether you believe that Huawei are telling the truth, or whether you believe that if it was an inconvenient truth, they would never come up with it. So the credibility of the company is an issue here, as well as the sort of technical side about what can you see about what you're buying. But it's not a new problem, it's an old problem.
There's a little bit to that. There's from the point of view of problems that we've already had, which are less sinister, are counterfeit products, and actually the way in which there's all sorts of quite sophisticated mechanisms by which components can be introduced into the marketplace. And historically, long before the sort of the more sinister aspects of the cyber threat, there's electron microscope scanning chips just to make sure that there wasn't a subtlety in there. That it actually was, it was a genuine chip, and that's to do with safety critical deterministic systems to make sure that it is, that batch of components actually is what it purports to be, and it's completely traceable back to its source, and you haven't got some sort of lower grade counterfeit which actually ends up distributing that, the safety critical chain is broken, and you end up with a catastrophic situation. So even going back before the cyber position, that there are sort of aspects you really have to make sure of for critical systems, and the modern world has. The safety critical systems, but now there's just society critical systems all over the place, and we do have to be careful.
And transport is a society risk system, and obviously telecommunications are a crucial part of the transport network. How does this play for you, Kavitha?
Well, I think this links to the point that Dave was making, that we are part of a global network and things move between different countries. Transport is constructed around the world. It is an international industry. Yes, it uses telecommunications, it uses a whole load of other technologies as well. Part of what we need to do is to make sure what we are using in terms of the networks are secure, they are resilient. That is through ultimately rigorous testing, because you need to make sure that you've got what you think you've got and it's doing what you think it should be doing. I don't think that actually matters who's delivering that network. It's something that you have to do no matter what. So the due diligence is always there to make sure that it remains secure.
I think this feeds into a broader issue of complexity in general and dealing with complex systems, which as things become more complex, they become more difficult to test, more difficult to simulate, more difficult to predict. What sort of factor does this add to the mix, Dave Palmer, in understanding these sorts of systems and coping with the problems that they can result in?
Either sadly or excitingly, depending on your point of view, we are definitely past the point where almost most software is beyond the point of human comprehension. I mentioned Linux computers, Linux an operating system earlier. The very smallest bit of Linux, the sort of, if you threw everything away but just kept the one bit that you say, no, we have to have this bit, has more than 12 million lines of code in it. There is no way that that is bug-free. There is no way that to the supply chain point, we can't know if someone has inveigled a little back door in there or made a mistake or whatever. And we've seen this played out at large scale, when in 2014, the world was suddenly alerted to something trendily at the time called Heartbleed, which was a fundamental error in an encryption library used by nearly every single one of us on nearly every single piece of technology in the whole world, from online banking to the way that your web servers work and how all of these pieces of technology hang together. 300,000 lines of code in that particular open source product. One typo found. That typo meant that no matter how good the encryption theory behind it was, that we effectively typed it in wrong, and encryption had been fundamentally broken for a long time, and suddenly nearly every IT person in the world had to change nearly every single IT piece of equipment in their personal lives, in their professional lives, etc. We say on average in the field, every 100,000 lines of code will have at least one major bug in it. Every 30,000 lines of code has at least one major bug in it. So there's at least a couple of dozen more in that really important encryption library. There are, I don't want to do the maths off the top of my head, but there's an awful lot of them in Linux. This complexity thing is vast. And I don't think we're really sure yet how we live in a world where we can't be completely convinced, to use Dave's word, that something is deterministic and even if it fails, would fail in a graceful way. That ship, I think, has long since sailed.
And Trevor Taylor, to what extent are our adversaries looking for these kinds of bugs and hoping to exploit them?
Well, I think we have to be quite careful about how we speak about what's happening, because China benefits enormously economically from its contact with the West, and collapse of the West economically would have major repercussions for China and for Chinese well-being. I think in the case of both Russia and China, the issue we have here is that they can experiment in a way in which they couldn't do with shells and bombs. That they can carry out attacks that can be presented as anonymous, they're deniable, even though in many cases they can be traced by the clever people on my right, but they're deniable, and they do not expect them to lead to some kind of major escalation. There's a question about, well, whether some cyber attacks actually are controllable in their consequences, that's a disadvantage of them, that you launch an attack at France, but actually the stuff then one way or another ends up in Russia because of the networks, and that's a complexity feature. But I think the problem that we have with China and Russia is that they are experimenting to a certain extent, seeing what they can get away with, seeing what our reactions are. This happens in the physical world as well. I mean, Russian aircraft flying down the North Sea, and we send aircraft up to look at them, and they look at our radar signatures, and we look at their signatures. But there is a bit more experimentation. It's deemed to be a safe thing to do without any big escalation risk. And that I think is something that we should worry about, because it may not be that safe. Events can get out of control.
Thank you. Let's have another question from the audience. Yes, this gentleman in the front.
Yeah, the panel has spoken a bit about the speed at which technology is evolving and things are changing and progress is being made in the world, but also talked about security as a process of testing and designing very carefully and trying to avoid risk and thinking about the risk. To what extent does the panel believe that security is fighting a losing battle against agility, or perhaps that agility is a valid form of defense?
Let me start with you, Dave Short.
It's clearly a difficult environment by the very nature of the opportunity space, and again going back to that, the vulnerability about the sheer opportunities which are out there. I think Trevor referred to the aircraft flying down the channel. I think though that rate has been increasing, I think it's only still 8 or 10 times a year, whereas there's about 150 million, 200 million attacks an hour taking place from a cyber point of view, and within those attacks, you end up with a small subset which are really quite sinister, which are a bit more sophisticated than the others, sort of type of thing. And you can see every now and again there's an emotional reaction which shows the vulnerability. There's an example with respect to the GOP attack on Sony, which was going back to 2017, where there was about to be the release of the film, which was the comedy film associated with the assassination of Kim Jong-un, and all of a sudden the state got into gear. They actually exercised some of the things they've been learning. North Korea was agile enough to be able to do a direct attack, take out X number of terabytes of data, destroy it from Sony, and actually bring the company to its knees within about 4 or 5 hours. And that was on the back of probably like the Jurassic Park testing of the fences, seeing what they can do, and then working out where the vulnerability actually is, getting ready, and then bang. And so of these hundreds of millions of attacks which take place every hour, a number of those are just testing the fences just to see how far. So you're not in a hot war, you're in a sort of a simmering, okay, we'll keep that one noted for later. So I think we've got a position where, going back to your agility question, we have to really invest heavily on our national defence and infrastructure to ensure that we try and keep one step ahead, or at least try and cover off all those gates that are being tested all the time. And I think this is something that needs heavy investment, and we need to get on with protecting those barriers.
Tabitha, how does agility play out in the transport world?
It's an interesting one. It's one I think about. So I think there's part of this becomes almost, I suppose, a contract with society. We can't plan for everything, speaking from my perspective. So as technology is evolving and people are taking more opportunities to use those new technologies because they make transport better, we need the people who are constructing them, integrating them, using them to think about how secure those are, and think about that. I mean, it's part of thinking about it in the design stage. If you are not just leaving it until the last minute because it's the thing you don't think about and you want to get it out to market quickly, but you're actually building it in at that early stage, that can increase your overall security. It's then looking at what else do you need in the particular circumstances that you might be interested in, whether that's in transport or if it's in any other way. We can't move at the slower pace we might have done in decades past when things just didn't evolve that quickly. So it has to be a sort of open discussion and debate of what are these new things coming in, how can we actually start by thinking about security and not think about it as an after effect or an afterthought when it's going to be more difficult to achieve and bluntly more expensive to deliver, and then impact on everybody's business model.
Trevor?
I think the thing in defence, there's a cliche in defence, which is a question that's always asked. The cliche is the enemy has a vote. So when you're thinking about defence systems, you are always thinking about what the other side's going to have, what the other side's going to do, how they're going to react. Can you future-proof it to a certain extent? I think when you're looking in the civil commercial world, people are looking much more quickly about profit, and they don't necessarily think that they've got an adversary out there. They don't even ask that question. So that's where you get into the situation where security does become an afterthought because people had got an eye on the commercial product they were going to ask. So I think from a defence point of view, the armed forces always assume they're going to be up against somebody who doesn't care for them very much and that will behave in an unpleasant way, whereas that's not necessarily something that happens in the civil and commercial world.
And agility in the cyber world, Dave, that's the place where it happens, isn't it?
I would say that the best thing you can do as an organization is modernize to improve your security. If you're on the latest version of Windows 10 or you have an iPhone and you keep all your apps up to date, and it's a relatively modern iPhone, you're in far better condition than if you're using some technology from even 3 or 5 years ago. Playing that out in a different scenario, if you're an organization that has hired lots of IT nerds like me, and you keep all your computers in a locked basement, and maybe you don't have all the money in the world, so you don't have all the biggest team as you would like, then there will be limits on how much you can do in securing that environment. But if instead you said, you know what, I'm not going to manage my email anymore, Microsoft can do that for me in the cloud, well, I absolutely am certain that Microsoft have got more email security experts than I would ever be able to hire. And so modernizing and being agile and saying, I'm going to give that away to Microsoft, their problem now, or specialists like BAE or us, is a really effective way of saying, right, I'm going to get back to my core business now. I've modernized that. I'll probably need to modernize it again differently in a few years, but at least it's a headache that's gone away for a little while.
I want to introduce a slightly different topic that we spoke about in the green room a little earlier, which is the interconnectedness of society and the way in which information can flow in ways that haven't been possible until the last 10 or 20 years or so. And in particular, I think the phenomena that has emerged in the last few years has been one associated with propaganda, with fake news, with the nature of truth. We've had the well-publicized interference by the Russians in the American presidential election in 2016, the less well-publicized interference in the Brexit discussions in Britain, and other activities all over the world. The nature of truth is at risk in all of this. But how are we going to fight back against this? Trevor?
Just a small question.
No pressure.
There's another cliche about the first casualty in war. And the book is called The First Casualty in War is Truth. So there's nothing novel about this, that as soon as parties see themselves as in a violently adversarial situation, they start to use information for their advantage. But I mean, I think the availability of information around the world is one sort of set of issues. I mean, and that relates particularly in terms of global politics to inequality. That you can have a generated television in an African village which shows American way of life as well as the Premier League. But so there's that awareness that you wouldn't have had 150 years ago, which is absolutely widespread of inequality. Then you've got what's an accurate reflection, the messaging thing. And there is no quick answer to that. I mean, it's not a new problem, but it was a problem, if you remember, that the BBC used to enjoy because it had credibility. And I think we will get to a stage where people will start to question the credibility of different sources of information. And of course, they have access to a wider range, so that don't believe just one source. You don't have to just watch Fox News to get your sense of what should be happening in the United States. But I think there will have to be issues raised about credibility and what constitutes a credible source. And that reflects also an ability to give out bad news about, in inverted commas, yourself. If you get organizations that only give out good news about yourself, they get a credibility problem because very few of us are perfect, just Dave and I. It's a major issue, as you said. Lots of people can communicate now, and there is a need for institutions to build their credibility and for users to make sure they don't just rely on one source.
Dave, short, how serious is this for our fabric of society?
Personally, I just go on to Trump's Twitter and he usually says whether it's fake or not. So, but I think in terms of historically, when people had a voice, it tended to escalate over a period of time. Before the days of the electronic communication era, that's so straightforward these days in terms of how you can actually get a message out there. Things used to build up and people had credibility that built up to the point at which they could be heard, sort of type thing. And these days, anybody can say anything to anybody, and the more controversial it is, the more visible it tends to be. So it is a more difficult thing. But we certainly have mechanisms and algorithms that we currently, BAE's got some elements of analysis techniques which actually are associated with scoring systems about looking at a broad set of data sets and actually look at the way in which what triangulates what looks like it's actually in tune with, and you can actually end up with a scoring system. But again, once that scoring system's in place, somebody could start to spoof it if they know what you're trying to do. So it depends on how you see society evolving, but ultimately it will be increasingly a problem for, it's okay when it's actually trivial, but actually, when it starts to affect society's decisions and actually starts to, again, if you've got somebody in the background just moving a few pieces around to move a few percentage points just to see what a nation would do if it did actually vote for Brexit, that sort of type thing would, it becomes ever more serious.
We need to worry about that. Kavitha, in the transport world, the flow of information obviously is crucial, but how does that play out?
Well, I mean, information is critical both in terms of running the systems themselves. They need to have accurate information, but the people who are using it rely on getting accurate information. Otherwise, we won't have, they won't have the ability to use it on a day-to-day basis. But I don't know, how that all fits together with this and the meaning of truth is a bit esoteric, because a lot of that's quite functional operational data. Do you know where your train is? Do you know when it's coming in on time?
Let me give you the example of the Oxford Circus incident in November 2017, where there were reports of gunshot, very widespread panic that spread very quickly over social media, and in the end it turned out that there was no evidence of gunshot wounds, and that has a big impact on people's transport that night.
And I think that goes much wider than transport. That could happen in any area, but a lot of this is around the, social media does spread information. People will pass messages on and pass messages on. There's a question of how do you establish what the truth is, because nobody knows instantly, and then how do you then communicate that out as effectively as possible using the methods that people use. There's no point putting something out on a news article as we might have done back in the day when it came around periodically if everyone's looking at Twitter. So you've got to use the methods that are most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. And I also just reflect back on my training as a scientist. We're always taught to, don't rely on one single measurement, one single incident, always confirm, always, question and challenge and look for corroboration of what you're doing. So I think that's just a skill we all need to learn day to day in society so that we can work on that.
Let me ask you about crowd control, obviously, which is part of the transport network. There have been some tragic incidences of stampedes in large crowds. I think the worst example was in Mecca in 2015 when 2,000 people died in a single stampede. So controlling crowds on a large scale becomes a very important life-saving operation.
Yeah, it does, and that's why, a large part of the safety designs of any of the transport systems is making sure that you can cope with those sorts of people and those sorts of numbers. And you don't just look at, well, how many people do I need to fit into whatever it is now, but actually what are the different circumstances that you need to do. So that's part of the sort of integral design, and that comes to thinking through all those scenarios, what are the risks that you're dealing with, and making sure you're planning for them up front. You can put measures into control when there's a particular instance on. I mean, look at any major event when you're expecting people to travel on the networks. You will have additional crowd measures in place, but there's an inherent safety design that goes with building anything to make sure what you've got is fit for purpose.
Dave Palmer, we have also this phenomena of a echo chamber or filter bubble where we can surround ourselves with the opinions that we want while ignoring everything that we don't want. How important a problem is that becoming in the online world?
I think it's an enormous problem, especially when we have companies incentivized by having human beings engage with their platform. We know that perversely, the stuff that's most engaging is and would cause you to spend longer on, say, YouTube, is the stuff where you have an emotional reaction to it. And sadly, for whatever reason, as we all use these platforms, things that cause us joy, we use less than things that cause us outrage or indignation. And you can test this for yourselves. If you go onto something like YouTube's probably the worst offender, and you type anything in, Great British Bake Off, whatever, and you just keep clicking next recommended video, after a period of time, and don't do it when your children are around, you will be steered into something probably pretty horrible. And that might be very different depending on where the machine thinks you fit into society, but it might start steering you towards white supremacist material or gender supremacist material or something else that's deeply offensive that most normal people would reject. And that is a big problem, but even if overnight we invented an AI that started stripping that material out, we definitely need to remember that just because it's not online anymore, those bad people haven't gone away. So recently, I feel like I'm picking on YouTube, but YouTube have suspended the ability to for paedophiles to write comments on videos involving kids. And everyone's like, what an enormous victory. Well, nothing has been done to actually start working with law enforcement or communities to start identifying those people, maybe try and bring them back before they become major offenders. In the CT world, we had the prevent strategies, and we did lots of community engagement to avoid terrorists being bred in our communities. But in the internet world, we seem to think that maybe if we just fix the internet, all of this stuff will go away. And I don't think that's true of the Nazis, the pedophiles, and some of the other horrendous people in echo chamber bubbles. And removing those features won't make them go away. So somehow, community responsibility is going to have to come back in, but I definitely don't know how. So please don't ask me that next.
Okay, let's go back to the audience. Any comments or further questions on those issues about the nature of truth? Yes.
The touched a few times on perhaps the nature of the adversary, in that, be it perhaps something state-sponsored, or be it perhaps a rebellious teenager in their bedroom. They could both potentially have the same effect of causing major disruption on a transport system for two perhaps very different reasons. How do we navigate this kind of, as mentioned in the intro, this very grey area of this blur between defence and security, and actually how we react to those two different approaches, but actually two kind of could potentially very similar outcomes?
Thank you. Tabitha.
Yeah, it's an interesting question of, if different people are trying to sort of attack your networks, whatever they are, for different reasons. To be honest, I don't really mind. I'm not interested in why they're doing it. I'm interested in what they're doing and what sort of disruption or danger that causes. So it's almost like construct your security to defend you against what you think the attacks are that could come at you in the network. And then whether that is somebody who's a disaffected employee, it's a teenager in their bedrooms, a global terrorist organization. If you have built your systems to be secure against the attacks that you think could come and the capabilities that are out there, then you will be secure. I would then look to other parts of the UK. There are people who are interested in those sorts of things and do want to pursue whoever is conducting it, and whether that's criminal activity, terrorist state. They will have their own interests, but from my perspective, it's we need to make sure we have those security systems in place, and then the network will still continue.
Dave Short.
Yeah, I think it's a very much a changing environment. If you think about historically, governments have actually been able to defend nations with quite understood bounds. You put your navy against their navy, the aircraft against their aircraft, or tanks against their tanks, and now you've got something which has such a high reliance on a private environment. You've got this situation where whether it be a kid in the bedroom, or whether it actually be a more sinister state-based attack, I think that the points that the nation has to defend is no longer just in the jurisdiction of the government, and that's where we need to be thinking more about how we structure things going forward, how our infrastructure has fallback positions, and how society starts to maybe partition things a little bit so that we have got a greater resilience. I think this is clearly not an area of expertise for us, but when it comes to the way in which that we I think we've got quite good defences these days against the kid in the bedroom. I think the things that we're probably more afraid of are the things which are quite a lot more sinister, with teams of 300 or 400 people and big computers behind them, working out how to do some quite subtle things and bring subtle things together in a combined way. So I think there's, I think if you're monitoring your systems in a certain way, you can start to see some of the way in which the system is being probed. And if it's something simple like a kid in the bedroom, I think there's usually a way in which you can find that more obviously these days than it used to be. But when it comes to the state attacks, they're far more subtle. And I think we as a society do need to actually work a way of having fallback positions. That's the way I think we'll end up. And it's not purely the jurisdiction of the government to actually be able to put everything in place. So it is a difficult scenario that we need to prepare for.
Dave Palmer.
My day job is worrying about this tactically. How can we use AI to stop a kid in the bedroom, or how could AI be joined together with lots of different data and organizations to stop well-resourced, perhaps nation-state-backed organizations. But I think the long-term progress will come from consequences, and I think that's true in other forms of warfare. I didn't come here today in body armor because guns exist and someone might shoot me. It's unlikely I would be shot on the streets of London because there would be consequences. And right now, in the cyber world, we occasionally jail a teenager because they found a vulnerability in TalkTalk or something like that. But there aren't real consequences for most cyber attacks. There are some when ISIS have tried to use cyber attacks, they got blown up. The Americans caught a hacker, identified him, and used a drone to blow him up. So you don't see very many ISIS-related cyber attacks at the moment. There may be a lot more we can do, whether that's through law enforcement, whether it's through diplomatic measures. It's worked in the past when former President Obama and the President of China made an agreement to reduce the corporate espionage on each other's countries from the state. Hacking went down. And the best way of measuring that is some cybersecurity companies reported significantly decreased sales and their share prices went down because a lot less hacking was going on. So I think diplomatic means can really help. I think Trevor is much more likely to be an expert on consequences and asymmetry than I am. But I don't feel that we get to the end result that we want from just building smarter and smarter technology defenses. At some point, we'll have to have some sort of societal engagement to be better with each other.
Trevor, do you think that activity in the grey zone is becoming more intense?
Well, I think the point I was going to make was that across the world we can see to a significant degree what you might call the privatization of defence. It's quite remarkable that we think of military companies, for instance, private security companies. We know that we make extensive use of those in some environments. So do the Chinese, so do the Russians. But what you see in the cyber area in particular is this attribute, this feature of being deniable, as to who's paid them. So you can have criminal gangs that you believe to be state-sponsored, but proving it in either a way in which you would be believed in the court of public opinion, or even harder, believed in the court of law. Those become really big challenges, and our adversaries know that. I think quite a lot of effort, it's not my area, but a lot of effort goes in the world that David lives in. It goes into tracing where things are coming from. Inflicting consequences is particularly difficult. I remember a tale from one of David's colleagues that they'd identified a building in China which was a source of cyber attacks. And not only did they identify the building, they knew when people came into work and when they went to lunch. But the days when you could put a Hellfire missile on that building are not here. And so trying to think of what apart from sending some of the people we know where you live messages, which might have some kind of effect on them, it's really very, very difficult with these deniable forces, because it's not necessarily, it's not civil servants that are doing it or people in uniform.
In terms of unintended consequences, my kids tell me that when they play battle royale games on the internet with lots of people fighting against each other, if they type in Tiananmen Square 1989, all the Chinese players get cut off immediately. Little tip for anyone that's playing that. I want to move on now to autonomy and robotics. This has become an increasingly important part of our society and R&D, the development of robotics and the company with that, the coupling of that with AI. Dave Short, how is that working out with your area?
I think, well, autonomy as a topic is a key topic from the point of view of how we actually take our capabilities forward from a defence perspective. And there's increasing examples of autonomy being used. And we have actually developed capabilities associated in particular with the air domain, but we've also done land and maritime. And there are advantages when you go into a high-risk environment that you actually have something which is unmanned. And there's also ways in which maybe with the autonomy you can actually do quite sophisticated things remotely, which are not something you can actually do easily at remote control, so there can be decisions that can be made. But at the end of the day, I think this is something which has got a general trend associated with it to actually increase the effective use of autonomy and actually allow it to be used to best effect. I think there's all sorts of cultural issues and actually the psychology about reducing, say, manning on a ship or on a submarine by having it autonomous. There's lots of benefits associated with the way in which you're reducing through life costs, making your machines more efficient or even smaller because they actually have to carry less people. But then there's also the cultural aspects of making sure that it fits in with the actual mode of operation with the customer base as well. So there's a cultural side to it as well as the actual practical and technology side. But I think it's pretty undeniable that there's a general trend towards the better and more effective use of autonomy where it actually can give competitive advantage in the battlefield. And it's something that actually also can have advantages from the point of view of the through-life costs and the actual practicality of running various capabilities.
I'm a bit more sceptical in a high level because I think it's apparent that robotics and autonomous systems work most easily in a controlled and stable environment. And a battlefield is about the least controlled, least stable, least predictable, in many cases. Yeah? There are some areas where we already have autonomy and we already can have autonomy, but whether we'd actually deploy it, or the circumstances under which we deploy it are quite limited. For instance, it's a widely quoted case, but the Brimstone missile, it can be used as an autonomous system. It has a loiter and ability to pick out a target, and it can be fired, I think, in a cluster, small cluster, and that's been around for the Cold War. But that was envisaged that it was over a battlefield where the only things around were enemy vehicles, and you could pick them out and attack it, destroy it, knowing full well it was an enemy vehicle. Now, obviously, in Afghanistan, that's not what you do. They were all individually targeted by a human being. So I think the complexity of a battlefield is going to raise a lot of questions. The other part of this is related, as with any autonomous system, but it's what are the consequences when it gets it wrong? If the consequences when it gets it wrong are pretty minor, so if Amazon start recommending things to you that you don't really want, it doesn't matter in broad terms. If you have something picked out as a target that's actually something quite different and it's destroyed, then the consequences are pretty serious. So there is, I think, a greater challenge for autonomy in many military contexts, not all, but in many military contexts. Remote control is different to autonomy. That's just a different thing. And I think that it will be slower, and there's the risk of it going wrong. Now, it may be that our Chinese and Russian friends are more happy with the risk of it going wrong than we are because the consequences of it might seem less to them. But these are the variables that we're looking at. When you look at the defense, it's the exact opposite of a car factory, let's put it that way.
Kavitha, I've seen some work about self-driving vehicles where they've been fooled into reading the speed limit wrong by just the placement of a couple of stickers, and cars that can be forced to change lanes by misreading the signs on the road. What can be done to cope with that kind of adversarial attack on self-driving vehicles?
Oh, well, I think so. part of it is around what are the design, what are you trying to design your vehicle to do? How autonomous is it? How much trust do you have in it? And that's the sort of society question as it goes forward. But in terms of spoofing it, confusing it, self-driving vehicles are at very early stages right now. I would say there's a lot of work still to do before we get to the point that we're all climbing into them and wandering off and they're sort of zipping around the roads on their own. Be a nice idea though, I'd love to get rid of my car. But we need to look at what are those things that can be done to disrupt the vehicles, and then how do you stop them? Now that might be changing what the design of the vehicle is. It might be actually there's something we need to change externally. Why are people trying to spoof this? How are they doing that? Is there something we can do to prevent that, to make that more secure? Changing the nature of the road signs, or changing how you determine the speed limit. There's lots of other things. We need to look at this not just as the vehicle itself, but the vehicle as part of the network. And that's why I think there's a lot of work still to do to make sure we've got all of those different moving components in place so that we can have a truly autonomous system. But we're working on it. We really are working on it.
Dick Palmer.
I think that point is so important. Why would we create autonomous machines and expect them to operate in the human-created world? To your point about changing the markings on the road or changing the speed limit signs, what if we just created a lane on the motorway and said human drivers are not allowed in this lane, only the autonomous vehicles are, and their instructions and their signaling is all digital and encrypted and protected and supervised. And we say we don't expect them to read the road signs and we don't expect them to look at the lane markings on the floor. There's lots of exciting things that become very tractable far more quickly when you start thinking about that. And there are plenty of parallels. Think about, not so much true in the UK, but a lot of European cities, they have the rules where the tram is the primary user of this particular space of the city. And if you crash into a tram, if a tram touches your car for any reason, it's your fault. Doesn't matter if the tram drove into you, it's your fault. You shouldn't have been in there. That's the tram zone. And my feeling is that's the way AI and autonomy will go, is let's create sandboxes where they can do their thing and minimize the rest of us making the autonomous vehicles' lives a lot more difficult.
I think let's come back on one bit. We already have quite a lot of autonomous systems which are around now. I think there's a difference between autonomy from the point of view that we've got, let's pick on aircraft, we've got ejection seats which actually can make decisions for themselves about the fact that it's time to get out, and it's not being initiated by the pilot. It's a whole series of complex calculations, but ultimately it actually is saving the life of the pilot. You've got defense systems which actually are more to do with situational awareness and surveillance, and they can do that on it. So it's not always about something going out on its own, doing its own thing and actually doing Hellfire missile type activities. There's all sorts of autonomy which actually has that as a mission criticality rather than a safety criticality that allows you to make some gains in terms of autonomy. And then you've also got defensive systems or just save the life systems which have also got a high degree of autonomy for them. And it's important you get those right. It's got a high degree of determinism, but the autonomy and the actual way in which the complex decision making is made is already there in a number of systems already.
We're drawing to the end of this debate. We've covered a lot of ground in this last hour, and I just want to finish off because we've discussed a huge number of quite serious issues and problems with security and the emerging technologies that are driving different types of threats. But I want to finish off by asking you very quickly, Trevor, are you optimistic about the future or pessimistic?
I'm quite optimistic about the technological future. I'm a bit pessimistic about the political future. But so I think it's going to be very demanding. One aspect of disruptive which we've not discussed is the extent to which technologies are actually going to disrupt the way we all live and the way we all operate, and who's important and who do we need. Now, in the military sphere, that's quite a big deal. because it's going to change the type of people we need as soldiers, the type of experience that we have for commanders, the attributes of a good leader, those sorts of things. They are disruptive of our organisation, if you like, and that's something we've not touched on, but it's a big and important topic. And it's not just a matter of whether an aeroplane has a pilot in it, although that's one of the big points.
Dave Short, optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm naturally optimistic because I think there's an increasing awareness internationally about how much we all depend on each other. So I think there might be a few perturbations on the way and a few incidents that make people realise how fragile things can be, but I think it won't be something that will actually end up in a bad place. I think society, by its very nature, has such an intrinsic integration, which is continuing to be ever more significant when it comes to how nations operate, how everybody affects everybody else. Then the actual consequences of doing anything to anybody gets to the point where it's not worth doing it at all. So that's where I think ultimately it might end up.
Tabitha?
I like to think I'm optimistic about it. Yes, there's new technologies. Yes, they come with different threats and risks, but they also come with great opportunities. And if we don't seize those opportunities, then we're really missing out. So, and people will want to use them. Businesses will want to use them because they will make life easier or they will make life more profitable. But then with that, the world adapts. People will want the security that goes with it because they'll want to know that those services are going to continue.
And Dave Park, we started with you, so let me finish with you.
Well, narrowly, in the cybersecurity bit, I think AI and future technology, I'm really optimistic about. I think we can start massively reducing the risks that we're all exposed to digitally by having systems that operate on our behalf. More broadly as society, I think all of us have got some decisions to make about how AI in particular changes our future society and the quality of life that we have, because we could swing towards maybe the Amazon warehouse experience where work and lifestyle is completely intensified, where you're micromanaged within an inch of your life. There's no joy in that experience. You are simply increasing productivity, as Kavith has talked about. Or alternatively, you could use the autonomy and freeing up of resources in the AI to have a more caring, interactive, customer interactive organization that you're part of, where we would probably all find a lot more joy, both in our work and as we interact with those organizations around us. That there will not be one big day where we all take a vote and 48% of the population goes one way or the other. It will be in our daily lives making tiny incremental decisions in all of our organizations that trends us in one direction or another. And I think right now you can pick companies out and see they're already going in quite different directions. So I'm on the fence about whether capitalism will deliver the right answer there or not so much.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Well, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we've run out of time and I must draw this discussion to a close. Apologies if we haven't been able to get to you for questions. You can find out more about this event and others on our website at newscientist.com. But please join me in thanking our panel, Dave Palmer, Kavitha Kishan, Dave Short and Trevor Taylor. And thank you to our sponsor, BAE Systems. And thank you all for your entertaining contributions. From me, Justin Mullins, and all of us at New Scientist, good night.